Here we go.
Okay, how are we here?
Go ahead.
Aloha everyone, welcome to Lion Arboretum and our Facebook Live. I'm Hadley Anderson, the Education Specialist here at Lion Arboretum, and with me today is Miles Thomas. He's one of our student workers, and he happens to be getting his master's degree from the University of Hawaii out here. Thank you for joining us, Miles.
Yeah, not a problem. Happy to be here.
Oh, so excited. So the type of species of hapu'u fern, right?
Yep. So, quick introduction to the hapu'u fern. The hapu'u fern is one of the most common species of native ferns, native plants in the forest still today. Prior to human contact, you would have seen them everywhere, but now they're here and there because of pressures from invasive species and pigs, but you will see them in the forest if you go hiking. The Sodium is a genus, and Sodium has 11 species. You have only representation in Polynesia is a the genus is also pretty wide and it's from related species of tree ferns. So let's explore some Hawaiian species. The first species I want to show today is actually not that common on Oahu. Common on the Big Island in Maui. The first species is hapu'u. The word glaucum comes from the word glaucus, which means to have a gray, green, blue hue. So one of the first things you look at for Cybodium glaucum is you have the upper surface, and then when you flip it over to the lower surface, you have this beautiful contrast of this pale gray, green, blue hue. This is the glaucous underside, so that's the first thing you look for. The second thing you want to look for Cybodium glaucum is on the frond detail. What part did you get out on?
We should be back. You were telling us about the auricle?
Oh, okay.
Yes,
yeah, so this auricle right here. Yeah, so it is on this species, it's consistent on nearly all of the frond. The frond is including this leaf, stem, and then you have what's called the blade right here, or if you're thinking like a botanist, you call it a lamina. So there's a word of the day.
That from laminate.
Laminate, yeah. Leaf-like. So when you also look at Cybodium, which means box. So when you arranged in little packets, little boxes, so that separates it from other tree ferns around the world and in cultivation. So it's a really good indicator that this is a Cybodium. All right, so that is Cybodium glaucum in a strict sense. We're going to go to the next species. So our next species is Cybodium chamiswa. So the species epithet, naturalist Chamiswa, which is a guy who did a lot of studying in the Hawaiian Islands. He's described a lot of plants, and actually there's a lot of plants named after him. This is the one of the plants right here. Cybodium chamiswa is the most common in the lowland and mid regions of Oahu. This is what you'll see hiking around Lion Arboretum, growing on its own or planted. So you can see that this does have a pale underside, but it's not glaucous. So when you look at this one, it's still kind of green, and it's yeah, it doesn't have that hue to it. It also lacks conspicuous auricles here, so that's how you can tell that this is Cybodium chamiswa instead of Cybodium glaucum. So if you look at here in the understory, you notice that there's a lot of hairs right here. So these hairs called pulu, so that's the other name for hapu'u. Pulu has abundant hairs. These hairs is also a key feature of Cybodium. A lot of other ferns have hairs, scales, and different varieties of hairs, but the tan, the golden brown hairs is common on a lot of hapu'u. Which brings us to our last species, which has very different hairs, different pulu than this species, is this guy right here. So this is hapu'u i'i. So in Hawaiian, i'i is the name for a dark, really dark, it's almost black red. So when you look at the hairs here, you notice that it's a dark red. And then when you go to feel so remember this is the petiole, right? You go to feel the petiole. Jenny, you want to feel the petiole?
There's nothing I would like more.
What does it feel like?
It's kind of coarse.
Yeah, it's coarse. It's super rough. So that's the hairs and then this rough texture, along with some minor details on the frond that you may need like a microscope to look at for those details, or you just need to be well seasoned with these ferns. But if you don't have any background in hapu'u, you go to the petiole, you look at the red stiff hairs, and you feel that coarse texture. That's hapu'u i'i in a nutshell. Hapu'u i'i are more common in the mid to higher regions on this island. So you find it a lot at the summit, just above over there. And then it's found through all islands. One species that we do not have at the Arboretum, so there are 4 native species of hapu'u, is Cybodium neliae, which is an endemic to the island of Kauai, and it may be a vulnerable or an endangered species now, depending on I don't know of any recent surveys that have looked for it, but from a friend of mine, Daniel Palmer, who wrote the book on Hawaiian ferns, he told me that it's not that common, and where it is common, it's only known from like a few localities that he's really seen. It could be more, there could be on this island, but as far as I know, Cybodium neliae is endemic to Kauai. So these are the species of Cybodium hapu'u that you can find in Hawaii. And there are other tree ferns in Hawaii that we need to look out for if you were to go to purchase a hapu'u, or if you see one in the wild. So there's 2 species of tree ferns that are, I would consider them, and a lot of my colleagues who work in conservation could agree, these are 2 of the most invasive species in the island, and it's a good idea to not plant these species. So planting pono. So the first one I'd like to introduce is this one. So this is a fairly young individual of what's known as the Australian tree fern, Cyathea cooperi. So before 2006, Cybodium and Cyathea were considered in the same family, but it has since been split, so Cybodium get their own plant family, the Cybodiaceae. This guy is retained in what's called the Cyatheaceae. These plants are really common in cultivation. There are several genera within the Cyatheaceae. So Cyathea, Spheropteris, and Amalgamorpha are all these other ones. They're native to the South Pacific. They're native to places like Vanuatu, Fiji, New Caledonia, Samoa, Tonga. What you need to look for this one is there's abundance of scales. So remember, hapu'u has a lot of hairs but no scales. These guys have conspicuous, really shiny, lustrous, almost like illuminating scales, and combined with hairs. And Jenna, I'm gonna have you touch the petiole again.
This is a really great first-person perspective.
Yeah. Abby, you want to try to feel?
Oh, sure.
Yeah. So at a young state, these plants may not retain a bunch of scales. They haven't put them out yet, but they always have this rough texture. And you can see the scales all go all the way into the lamina, into the blade. So on almost every axis of division, you have these scales and this rough texture. Ethnobotanically, you would strip away these scales in places like Vanuatu, and you would use it as a grater.
Oh, really?
So, like, these plants get 30 meters, so like almost 100 feet tall.
Oh my God.
So you can imagine like a really big one, like I told you, this is a keiki, like a young one. Really big ones, the petiole is probably more like this, maybe 3 times bigger. Yeah. So yeah, that's the Australian tree fern. If someone sells this to you as a hapu'u, please educate them and say would not be wise to plant such an invasive species, although it's a very beautiful species and it deserves to live where it comes from. So, the next one, the last one, is one that probably everybody who has ever hiked on Oahu or in the Hawaiian Islands has seen, is this guy. This is also a teenager. This is not the biggest that these get.
Do you want to hold it for
So
me?
if you ever... Okay, here, let me hold this for you so you can show.
So this is Angiopteris evecta, which is the mule's foot fern. It actually is not related to either of these hapu'u or the Australian tree fern. It's in a much older lineage, so it's in the family Miradiaceae, which evolved, or they diverged from what we know as the regular ferns or in the Polypodiales. That's a a section of the fern family or fern group. Those are newer. This is from a really old lineage, and these are common throughout the South Pacific and Hawaii and other places. Hawaii has one species, Miradia douglasii, that's related to this Angiopteris. That is a rare species now today. But this guy has taken that place of Miradia in Hawaii as its invasive counterpart. Angiopteris evecta was like the Australian tree fern, was introduced through cultivation, and it is now, from what I've seen in the field, has gotten into almost every gully in the mountains here. So it's not the best situation you want as a person who wants to do conservation, but it's a thing we have to deal with. And sometimes I see these being sold in stores. So again, it's not a good idea to sell such a prevalent species. A good thing about this fern though is you can eat it. So at the base of the petiole, below where I lopped this frond off, there is a big mass at the base of it, and there are these two leafy appendages called stipules. Those can be cooked and eaten. People in the South Pacific eat it, and I am pretty sure the fiddleheads are edible as well. Though you don't want to eat too many ferns because some species have high amounts of carcinogens in them. So you either cook it well or you only eat it sparingly.
Right.
Yeah, or you just choose the species that has the least amount. So.
Well, I mean, you said earlier too that it might actually taste a little bit like turnip, so that might actually prevent a lot of people from eating it anyway.
Yeah.
Myself included. I'm not a fan of turnips.
Head on. But yeah, you'll see this one in the lower forest and in really disturbed sites. So if anybody on Oahu has hiked the Maunawili Falls Trail,
yes,
there are a bunch of these surrounding the Maunawili waterfall. So yeah, these are well naturalized, and this is, like I said, this is a teenager. I've seen fronds twice, maybe 3 times as big as this. And I did some studying in Vanuatu and the island of Natium, and I saw some huge ones there as well. And it's native over there though, so I saw it in its natural habitat. In Hawaii, it grows a little bit more prevalent, it's a little unchecked. But
right.
Yeah, but yeah, just wanted to show you folks that this species and the Australian tree fern over there,
You're gonna trip over it?
These
awesome.
These may be presented to people as hapu'u, so you know that there are differences, and you can tell from this species as well. The division in this blade, so you look at the first axis, once, twice, this is what's called twice pinnate.
Okay.
So a pinna is this lobe right here, and the pinule is this lobe. So you always start with what's called the rachis. So petiole, rachis, once pinnate, twice pinnate. Versus this thing and hapu'u, this has the same dissection as hapu'u, so it's once, twice, almost 3 times pinnate.
Right.
So there's another
separation of the leaf.
Exactly. So there's another layer of division. And besides, this one gets like really, really huge too. So hapu'u don't get that big. But
so can I spring something on you really quick, since you do like to talk about ferns and stuff like that?
Yeah.
When of course, like when I think of ferns, I always think of the low ferns, as opposed to these are species of tree fern, right?
Yes.
So can you tell us a little bit about the differences between the two?
Yeah. So tree ferns have a specialized rhizome. So when you look at a fern stem, it's referred to as a rhizome, and like Hadley said, a lot of them are super small or they creep on the ground. These guys have more or less lignified tissues in their stem, so it's like really sturdy. It's not woody, but it's really tough, you know?
Okay.
So they're vascular bundles. So if you were to chop like a big one of these, do a cross section, you have like a bunch of concentric rings.
Oh, cool.
And really interesting architecture. That tissue is enough to keep them that lignified tissue and that arrangement is enough to keep them, structurally good when it's swaying around.
Oh,
yeah.
Cool. All right. That's great. Jenna, do you notice any questions from the audience by any chance?
Let's double check.
Okay. But I learned a lot today, so thank you so much for educating us on some of the native species of hapu'u tree ferns, and then some of the invasives that are kind of masquerading on occasion as our native tree ferns too.
All right. No audience questions.
No audience questions? Well, I think we're okay to wrap it up. Is there anything you'd like to add? Any shout outs you'd like to give?
Just shout out to Line Arboretum, everybody who has been so nice to me as a student worker. I really appreciate working here. Shout out to everybody who does conservation in Hawaii. We're kind of facing an uphill battle every day, so every bit of help counts. And thank you folks for tuning in to learn about hapu'u. Yes.
We do have one question.
We got one question sliding in. Are there any tree ferns that can grow in colder climates here in Hawaii?
Hapu'u can. I've seen hapu'u grow all the way to nearly the 6,000 foot mark on Mauna Kea. Given that they're in a forested area, they don't do well out in the open in frost conditions. But if you have them under trees, that keeps enough residual heat and humidity for them.
And what of the 3 species you talked about today, is one of them better adapted for
cold climates?
I would do Cybodium glaucum. That's the one that you usually see up at higher elevations. Menziesii, hapu'u may be a good match as well. May I ask what elevation they're living at? Is there a way you can answer?
Yeah, they can. If they're tuning in right now, they can comment.
We'll see if we get an answer as to what elevation they're thinking of.
Glauconium is the one that has the little mitten, has the little thumb, right?
Glaucum. Yeah.
Glaucum.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So we went over Cybodium glaucum.
Yes.
Cybodium
Chemiswa.
Chemiswa. Okay.
Some people say chamisoi, but it's a French name, so chemiswa is
Chemiswa. And then Cybodium menziesii. Menziesii. Thank you.
Very good.
See, you can tell he's a taxonomist by trade, and I am an educator by trade. So, did we get any elevation? Okay.
I think we're gonna wrap it up.
Cool.
We're gonna wrap it up. Any other questions that come up after us, please feel free to comment, and we'll do our best to answer those. Also, horticulture is actually going to be doing a takeover of our social media next week. So if you have some horticultural specific questions or some specific questions for Miles, they're going to be running our social media for the entire week next week. I'm going to be on vacation, but that's no big deal. These guys are going to be taking over, so you'll see some posts from our horticultural department and some of the work that they've been doing over there. So Miles, again, thank you so much. Let's do another one like this.
Yeah,
about another fern or about hapu'u fern.
Plant,
I'll do it again.
Sounds good.
And we'll say ahui ho.
Right.
See you next time.
Ahui ho, guys.